The moral principles that will be discussed on this module are called preliminary theories because in this arena of competing ethical theories, they belong to those that are heavily criticized on account serious flaw that a scholar cannot help but recognize. Nonetheless, our frequent employment of this principle to justify an act as moral makes these theories worth discussing, and whether the word of preliminary or finalist appropriately describe the classified theories will be left open to your careful scrutiny.
Ethical relativism. This movement ethical principle rejects absolutism, which insists on the existence of universally acceptable ethical truths. It exposes instead the idea that each moral situation is unique and that no absolute universal truths apply. The differences are due to diverse cultural heritage, varied religious affiliation, different prevailing social norms, and even distinct individual preferences. Ethical relativism. Ethics is relative. What is right for me might not be right for you. There is always has been a good deal of diversity which regards of right and wrong. Moral beliefs change over time and in a given society. The social environment plays an important role in shaping moral ideas. Right and wrong are based on social norms such could be the is with situational ethics. Ethical relativism may be understood through these lines for Sir Richard Burton. There is no good, there is no bad. This be the whims of mortal will. What makes me will the calls I good. What harms and hurts I hold as ill. They change with space. They shift with race, and in the various space at time. Each vice has worn a virtuous crown. All good been banned as sin or crime. Example number 1. These lines from Sir Richard Burton start the idea that what we desire and what we consider good may vary from time to time, from person to person, from society to society. In short, what may be morally right for you may not be morally right for another. Context determines the nature or moral actions. Certain acts that are usually considered moral bad may be morally permissible under certain circumstances or exceptional case. Example, pornography is considered an erotic behavior that violates the morality of a person. On other hand, nudity of human body is considered an artistic, so pornography may not morally bad in all cases.
John Dewey, in support of relativism, asserted that human beings should judge and be judged in the context of the complexities that characterize human life. This implies that you have examined each ethical situation as a particular case rather than a general one. It is only rational to inquire into the detailed makeup of each moral situation before evaluating an action. So Dewey, in contrast, argued for more experimental approach rather than a grand and final explanatory account of moral life. Ethics describe that intelligent methods for dealing with novel and morally perplexing situation. There are no stipulated ultimate values, nor should be sought, at least the best only value toward which he would gesture was growth. Moreover, actual conduct is undertaken not by isolated rational actors but fundamentally social beings. Is always shared. This is all difference between in a psychological process is it is an ethical oath that conduct should be social. It is a social whether good or bad. And Plato, for one, called ethical relativism as ethical irrationalism, the search for knowledge. He said, in search for the real, and knowledge gained is absolute, universal, and objective. He considered good, which he described as absolute, as a final goal sought by all things in universe. So Plato claims that moral relativism has no ethical or legal ground to stand on since it refutes itself. Its values and standards are objective and dependent on perspective. Then anyone is free to adopt on his own perspective the idea that moral relativism is false. And Immanuel Kant is another philosopher who disapproved of relativism. Like other absolutists, Kant believed that there are universal rules that determine what is right thing to do, rules devoid of it if and dependent of what people may individually or collectively desire to do. He called these rules categorical imperatives. Kant agreed that there are universal ethical truths and transcend time, space, culture, and other individual differences according what goes for one goes for all. And Kant, one idea is universality, which should follow rules of behavior that we can apply universally to everyone, and one must never treat people so means to an end but as an end in themselves. So indeed, ethical relativism, to take an extreme, could expose moral choices to a million one self-serving justification. Anything can be considered moral, that tantamount to a very loose definition of morality. Indeed, be that as may, that fact is many people adhere to this school of thought. An ethical relativism is a theory that holds that morality is relative to norms of one culture, that is whether of action is right or wrong depends on the moral norms of the society in which is practiced. The same action may be morally right in one society but may morally wrong in another. For the ethical relativists, there are no universal moral standard that can be universally applied and to all people at all times. The only moral standard against which society's practices can be judged are its own. If ethical relativism is correct, and there can be no common framework for resolving moral disputes or for reaching agreement or ethical matters among members of the different societies.
Ethical absolutism. Ethical absolutism asserts that there should be fixed or rigid factors in evaluating actions. Fixed factors are universal, constant, and therefore unchanging reason for judging an action as good or bad, right or wrong, just or unjust, among others. As discussed earlier, relativism considers factors or reasons that vary depending on the context. Computer hacking, for example, will not be considered evil or bad by relativists. Such an act may be good in one case and bad in another context. There is no fixed evaluation of an action. So ethical absolutism is the concept that ethical rules are the same everywhere. As an example of ethical absolutism, consider that the United Nations unanimously passed the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, from which some of those rights are: everyone has the right to life, liberty, and security of person. No one shall be held in slavery or servitude. No one shall be subjected to arbitrary arrest, detention, or exile. So, a system of ethical truth that focuses strongly on all rights and duties is likely founded upon the concept of ethical absolutism. Many religions promulgate a set of "thou shalt not" rules that do not allow for various interpretations under any circumstances. These rules are all based on ethical absolutism. It's a position which argues for the existence of objective values and intrinsically moral acts. Such, there can exist moral principles which are always valid and correct.
Ethical absolutism is also known as moral absolutism. And ethical absolutism simply argues that one must follow a consistent ethical standard, one that is universal in nature. And in ethical terms, Absolutism are known to maintain that some things are right and some other things are wrong, and that these things are fixed for all time and all people. And ethical absolutism is a moral command or prohibition that's true for all time, in all places and all situations. Ethical absolutists would not consider an action bad in one sense and good in another. In doing this, ethical absolutists say you commit the fallacy of contradictions. All actions must be black, bad, or white, good, and never gray, qualified, at any given time. If computer piracy is wrong, or infringement of intellectual right and property is wrong, then the same should be so in all such incidents, no matter what the circumstance. So, the absolutists implies that the moral way of living is to do things that are objectively good and avoid things that are objectively bad. In ethical absolutism, things that are right or wrong can change. They aren't affected by mitigating circumstances. They don't depend on the situation. For example, absolutists might say that torturing children, rape, and murder are always wrong. They don't change according to the culture in which you live. What is right and wrong for you is the same for me and for everybody in the world. Immoral acts are intrinsically wrong, which means wrong in themselves. The thing isn't made wrong by the situation or the result it causes. It is wrong because the act in itself breaks a moral rule.
So, my topic is ethical egoism and ethical altruism. Ethical egoism and ethical altruism are two other principles of morality that we usually use to support certain ethical judgment. So, ano nga bang ethical egoism and ethical altruism? Ethical egoism is the view that people ought to pursue their own self-interest and no one has any obligation to promote anyone else's interest. It is thus a normative or prescriptive theory. It is concerned with how people ought to behave, and it is the moral doctrine that everyone ought to act to promote his or her own interests exclusively. Ethical egoism is often equated with selfishness, and ethical altruism is referred to behavior that benefits another individual at a cost to oneself. So, ethical egoism is a completely opposite of ethical altruism. So, traceable to Thomas Hobbes, a well-known English philosopher. So, sino nga ba si Thomas Hobbes? Thomas Hobbes was an English philosopher considered to be one of the founders of modern political philosophy. Hobbes is best known for his book Levitian. So the Levitian Hobbes casts light on ethical egoism by introducing the theory of motivation according to him. What predisposes us to act in a certain way is determined by whether it is an object of aversion or object of desire. So according to Hobbes have no intrinsic value. The assessment of their moral value hinge on how they are categorized. Objects of desire are labeled good while objects of aversion are considered evil. So, yung different ko ng ethical egoism and ethical altruism is egoism can be defined as extreme self-centeredness, where altruism can be defined as selflessness. An egoistic person only cares for himself, but an altruistic person cares for others, ignoring his own self. So Hobbes depicted human being as being completely and inclusive, egoistic. So the successful pursuit of desire leads to gratification and happiness. So Hobbes' theory assumed that sole motivation is a moral choice and doing things is the satisfaction of self-interest. So human beings are devoid of genuine feeling of sympathy, benevolence, or sociability, which make it unthinkable for them to prioritize the welfare of others and over above their own. So from the point of ethical egoism, so his fear of sooner or later, what he did will be discovered to be untrue and hence could be a ground for him to be penalized, or his feeling of superiority over others. This is his high regard for himself. So egoists believe that there is no such thing as a pure altruism or desire to promote the good of others. So they believe that altruistic action merely masks self-interest. So all choice altruistic one considered are determined by the immediate pleasure felt by the person doing it.
So, among the possible egoistic explanations of his actions are: he gets a feeling of satisfaction from being trusted by his friends. So, as a person, that being egoistic may satisfy you when you are trusted or other people take side with you. Number 2, it is pleasing to receive expressions of gratitude and praise from friends with whom he had shared his program. So when you are stunning, they will admire you. They are being impressed by your character. Number 3, he feels more comfortable sharing his own programs than being amazed by other people's intellectual creations in computing. So if you are egoist, you will prefer your own program because of your high basis. 4, he fears disapproval by his friends. So every person is afraid of rejection. The last, his act of sharing earns him a good reputation. So when you are sharing knowledge, you gain a good moral. All explanations point to the benefit that the computer whiz get from his seemingly altruistic act. Thus, this act is not truly altruistic. Various thinkers have tried to debunk the egoist theory. The Utilitarian, for instance, contend that altruism is feasible and realistic, defining morally good actions as those that could bring about the greatest amount of happiness to the greatest number of. Utilitarian argues that altruism is a moral responsibility. One of us has a sense of fairness that rouses us to rational our selfish actions. So it says that altruism is a moral responsibility because it is feasible and realistic. So a good action could bring a happiness, and we believe in equality and fairness. Egoism portrays human beings as terribly self-centered. Ethical egoism means we ought to act in our own self-interest. We are required to do what we wanted. Everything that we do is for our own good. It means you have no right to foresee my actions, and no one has any obligation to promote my own interests. It is thus a normative or prescriptive theory. It is concerned with how people ought to behave. People can only act in their self-interest. Aside from being rational, human beings are social beings. The sense of being part of a collective explains, to some degree, the notion of altruism. What harms the whole harms one. For the collective to function, the rights, freedoms, and self-interest of each member must be taken into account. In this sense, no one has absolute right or freedom. A person desiring to exercise her right or freedom must respect the rights and freedoms of others in order that society shall be maintained. So you have to respect one another. Her right and freedom may differ with you. Her self-interest is different from you.